We didn't need to bring tents. Our group had people ages 18 to mid-60s. We had a range of experience. One member of our group had never been backpacking before. Then there was me. I'd spent a ton of time outdoors for work, but not a lot of backpacking. And we went to the White Mountains, where I hadn't been since I was about 5 years old. It was an incredible trip. The trip started and ended at the Ammonoosuc Ravine Trailhead because we were heading up the Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail. In that parking lot, there is a day use fee. So we put the money in the envelope and headed out. All right, here we go. The trail starts off a gentle, rolling, woodsy trail, going through the woods and then along the edge of the river. But immediately, it was beautiful, with these dense emerald green patches of moss that just felt magical. There were streams to cross, there were little and big waterfalls and beautiful pools. As the trail goes on, it gets steeper and rockier and eventually into the Alpine Zone. There were so many beautiful places to stop, and we did stop quite a few times. We're like a mile and a half up our trail, and we've already stopped for snacks. The Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail is about 3 miles long, but it covers about 2,600 feet of elevation gain. So once you start that climb, there's a lot of scrambling. In fact, there's even a ladder at one point. We jokingly talked about 4 points of contact. 4 points of contact! Or even 5 when you're kind of crab walking up and down the rocks and maybe you're using 2 hands, 2 feet, and your butt too. I mean, I'd rather crab walk or even slide down on my butt than risk falling and getting hurt. There is no shame in 5 points of contact. One of the great things that I found looking back at the video footage is that I could see members of the group getting more and more comfortable on the terrain, crossing the streams and climbing over the rocks. One member of the group, my niece, who normally would have been super strong, was getting over bronchitis. So some of these climbs were tough on her. And this was one of the most beautiful things about the trip, is that we really bonded as a group. My 2 sons offered to carry her pack, and it just felt like the right thing to do. And I was so glad that she was gracious enough to allow them to do that so that we could all enjoy that climb up together. Honestly, it made it better for all of us. If you listen to the soundtrack of this, you'll hear every few minutes somebody saying, "Oh my God," or "That's so cool."
This is so cool, Marion.
I know. Because every bend we came around, the terrain changed, the scenery changed, the weather changed. Moments where the fog parted and we could see a view, or just little pieces of moss or rocks along the trail side. As we got to the top, the Lakes of the Clouds hut began to emerge from the fog. We couldn't even see it until we were 20 or 30 feet away, which was really magical feeling. It was like we had arrived at this magical oasis at the top of the mountain. I have a whole long detailed video just about the Lakes of the Clouds hut if you want to hear more about that experience, and it's well worth it. Short version is we stayed at the Lakes of the Clouds hut. We were really lucky that there were 6 in our group, and we got our own 6 bunk room all to ourselves. So it was like a great family slumber party. Day 1, we hiked up to the hut, spent the night there, had a fantastic dinner, woke up early. They wake you up at 6:30 by singing, but then they make up for the early morning by feeding you an amazing breakfast at 7. Then they give you the current weather, which they get by radio from the peak of Mount Washington, and they announce at breakfast and hang on a clipboard in the side of the dining room. So day 2, we headed out pretty early.
Where are we going? Mount Washington!
With a goal of reaching the summit of Mount Washington. To get from Lakes of the Clouds to the top of Mount Washington, we took the Crawford Path. It's only about 1.5 miles and only about 1,500 more feet of elevation gain, but that whole hike is exposed and most of it above tree line. There's this feeling of the wind coming across that open terrain. It reminded me of the wind on the ocean where there's nothing slowing it down. It's just flat open winds.
This trail here is Crawford, and that way is the hut, that way is the peak.
Terrain was just so exciting and changing. There were rock fields and rubble. As we got to the top of Mount Washington, there was this funny, crazy moment where we were in this dense fog and there were these perfect white circles in the sky. And we were joking that they were portals to another universe. It definitely looked like that. And then the fog started to part, and of course they were some kind of scientific equipment that they use in the weather observatory. You've probably heard that Mount Washington is famous for having the worst weather in New England or maybe in the US. The weather can get crazy even in the middle of the summer, so it is important to bring backup clothing and to check the weather before you head out. Since we were staying overnight at the Lakes of the Clouds hut, we were able to leave a bunch of things there to lighten our load. We did bring packs with us that had warm layers of clothing and some basic supplies. The terrain on the way up was so varied. There were stone walls and places where the cairns were only, 10 or 15 feet apart, and you could see why, because when the fog gets totally socked in, you would not be able to see from one to the next. I don't know if you've read any books about Mount Washington, like Not Without Peril, but there's stories in there that are incredible about some of the weather conditions that can roll in at the top of Mount Washington. And just seeing that terrain and seeing those cairns, it gave me a much deeper understanding of what that was all about. One thing that was amazing to feel was the difference it made to just step behind a rock or a wall or a cairn and be sheltered from the wind. After you pass that observation center at the top, you pass the Tip Top Hotel. It's no longer a hotel, it's this cool stone fortress-looking building that used to be a hotel at the top of the mountain. Then it's a little strange because you suddenly are greeted by the people who drove up the auto road or took the cog railway up, and there's a big visitor center which is warm and dry and has plumbing and bathrooms and electricity and a cafeteria. But we enjoyed that. We had lunch up there and even bought some souvenirs. It was another shock heading back out of there. In fact, we left and saw the weather, came back in, added some layers, and went back out again, because by the time we left the peak, the rain was coming down sideways and the wind was unbelievable. The weather was crazy, but just crazy enough to be fun, not crazy enough to be dangerous. On the way back down from Mount Washington, we decided to make it a loop and take a different route. So on the way back down, we took the Tuckerman Ravine Trail, then we passed the cutoff and had to go back a little bit and find the Tuckerman crossover. We took that to the Davis Path and that to the Camel Trail west, back to the Lake of the Clouds hut. To get from the Lakes of the Clouds hut to the peak of Mount Washington was a little under 1.5 miles. The trip back from the peak of Mount Washington to the Lakes of the Clouds hut was more like 1.7, but we got to pass over the top of Tuckerman's Ravine. The terrain is just spectacular. I know I keep saying that, but it really, I just don't have the words to express it. There were these giant rock fields where you're just walking across stacks of these loose rocks and exposed terrain. And as you go down, there are areas where it's flat, wide open, winding trails. And when the sun comes out and the sky clears, you can see the cairns dotting all along the trail. Just an amazing sight. It felt like Lord of the Rings or some crazy fantasy environment. As we came back toward the hut, the sky started to clear.
I see the sky!
And it happened just as we were passing over Tuckerman Ravine. I've been hearing about skiing in Tuckerman Ravine my whole life, but I've never been there, and I keep running out of words. And then we could see the hut and the two lakes for the first time. And I don't know why it felt so amazing, but it really did. We walked the rest of the way back to the Lakes of the Clouds hut, took a look at those lakes, and then took a quick break before we headed out on a quick loop of Mount Monroe. And the sun had come out, the sky had cleared, the vistas were incredible. We took the Mount Monroe loop trail up Mount Monroe and came back by way of Crawford Path. And the views were really breathtaking, stunning. I don't know if those views were that much better than the views at Mount Washington, or it was just the timing because the sky cleared. But that was one of the great things about it, was every view, every moment, it felt like such a treat because you never knew when the sky would open up or close up. It really, the whole thing was just incredible. I mean, this is terrain I've heard about my whole life. And so just to be up there, to be in it was such a joy and a privilege. And to get to share it with our two sons, with my sister-in-law who'd never hiked anything like that before, and with my brother who, like me, has memories of being there when we were tiny children, and with my niece, to pass this on. The first night, because it was such a privilege, I was like, we have got to go out and see the sunset. It was so socked in, there was nothing to see. But the second night, the wind was whipping, and I insisted on going out to take a look anyway. And we were rewarded with this moment where the sky cleared and the rays came shining down. And you'll see it in this time lapse. It only lasted for a few seconds. We were just awed by it, and then the clouds and the fog came rolling back in and closed it back up. The next morning, again, the hut crew wakes everybody up at 6:30 by singing a different song this time. And we were planning and preparing to head down. The weather report over breakfast said that at the peak of Mount Washington, there were 70-mile-an-hour gusts. There were wind chills 30 degrees below the actual temperature. But the good news was we were heading down that day and not up. Because of the high winds, we decided to go back the way we came by way of the Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail. There is another trail we had thought about trying, the Jewel Trail. It's a little bit further, a little more gentle on the way downhill, but from what I understand, looking at the maps and hearing from people, it's a lot more exposed for the first mile or so. So it made sense to head back down the Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail. Of course, even though we went down the same trail that we went up, it looked completely different this time. Partly because we were seeing it with new eyes, also partly because the weather had changed and the sun came out. This time, again, 4 or 5 points of contact on the way down, even some butt slides just to make sure nobody got hurt. As we walked down on that last stretch of gorgeous river, there was a pool there that called to me. And even though it was so cold, almost all of us decided that we needed to just take a quick dip. It wasn't really a swim, it was more of a dip, and I don't have any video of it. It was the perfect way to cap the whole experience and to reset. I think I can confidently say that every single one of us had an incredible time on this trip.